We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix Steli porta.
Everybody, Steve with Sense of Fidelity. I'm coming at you on the 13th of May, Friday the 13th of March. My fault. I'm an idiot. Forgive me. I forgot what month it was. Coming with Dr. Alan Fimister of the book that he's co-authored with Father Thomas Crean, Integralism, a manual of political philosophy, to talk about Christendom, past, present, and future. Dr. Alan, thank you for joining, and tell us a little bit about yourself to start.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. I'm from England, from the northeast of England, Newcastle upon Tyne. I teach theology at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver, Colorado. I studied history as an undergraduate, and then philosophy and theology at Oxford University. And then I went to Austria and studied Catholic theology at an institute that John Paul II founded there. And then I did a doctorate at Aberdeen University, which was founded by Pope Alexander VI, famously immoral Borgia pontiff. And I did my studies on the influence of Catholic, particularly the philosophy of St. Thomas, on the people who founded the European Union, particularly the chap called Robert Schuman, who was the main founder of the European Union back in the early 1950s. And then eventually I wound up teaching at that place in Austria that I had been studying at, and for about 5 years. And then I came to Denver, Colorado. And just over the last few years, I've been working on this manual of scholastic political philosophy with a great Dominican called Father Thomas Crean, who's also an Englishman, though he's from the south of England, whereas I'm from the north.
What's with the English thing? You don't like us, the guys in the States? You guys stick with
I'm sure if he suggested the idea to me, so it wasn't that I
something to get back at the war or something, huh? So
I'm married to a Texan, so I'm very open-minded.
So talk about Christendom, past, present, and future. Where do we want to start with this?
Well, I mean, I think in understanding, one of the courses I teach at the seminary is church history, and in understanding the history of the church and also understanding what the church is in some ways, the concept of Christendom is very important because it reflects the lay side of the church's identity. And if we lose hold of that, we kind of lose a sense of what the church is, both in the present and in the past, and therefore also in the future. So for example, we tend to the history of the church tends to get reduced to a kind of history of the papacy instead of a history of the church. Obviously, the papacy is crucial. If you're not in communion with the Pope, you're not in the church. So it's important. But it's still not the same thing as the church. And so it tends to obscure our proper understanding of church history, and then it obscures our understanding of the present day, because we tend to think of the church as being the clergy. So you'll often get this. Someone will come and tell you that they've been treated very badly by the church, and you say, well, oh gosh, were you unjustly excommunicated by an ecumenical council? And then we say, no, Father such and such was rude to me the other day. And you're like, well, yeah, Father such and such is not competent to represent the entire church, and you yourself have certain duties in representing the church relative to other people. So and I think when we lose a sense of the fact that that the temporal order, what we call the state, although that's probably a misleading term, but anyway, but the temporal order ought to be conformed to Christ, and that's the job of the laity, then we lose a sense of the laity really being part of the church and what the laity are doing, and we lose a sense of what the church is and what it has achieved and done in history, and it's damaging theologically, it's damaging morally and spiritually. So I think the understanding the lay aspect of the church's identity, which is at its fullest is realized in the realization of Christendom, which is the subjection of the temporal order to Christ, is crucial for understanding what it means to be a Christian.
Again, the hierarchy, correct? We got laymen wanting to be priests and priests wanting to be laymen, so everything's all discombobulated right now. So,
absolutely, that's right. You'll get sermons on things that are nothing to do with the clergy, and then the same priests who are preaching those sermons will be trying to get the laity to turn into little clerics and start dispensing Holy Communion, and it doesn't make any sense at all. That they should be preaching about the Blessed Trinity and what I need to do in order to be saved, and the laity should be sitting in the pews and participating in the Mass like lay people, and then going out and subjecting the world to Christ.
No, I'm trying to get a hold of this one priest to talk about. You'd appreciate this, Father Noel, Blessed Noel Pignot.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first text, he sent me, I sent him, hey, Father, it's Steve from the emails. We've been emailing back and forth. And his response was, son. I'm going, man, that was a great response from a priest to call son. I mean, didn't offend me, anything. He's father, I'm son. Okay. And how come we can't figure that out? Was any other time in church history that we were, I don't know, thinking we could run the church?
Yeah, so I mean, the clergy are the only people who are competent to act on behalf of the church, but that doesn't mean that they are the church. So that happens on quite a modest level as well. So the church is acting when a pope or an ecumenical council solemnly defines a truth of the faith. That's the church acting, right? And the church is acting when a priest validly consecrates the Eucharist or validly and licitly baptizes a child. And the church is acting when a law is promulgated for the entire church. But when a priest gives a slightly dodgy sermon and says there are 5 persons in the Trinity or something, that doesn't mean the church has just said there are 5 persons in the Trinity. Or a priest invalidly baptizes a child because he says, I baptize you in the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Sanctifier. That doesn't mean the church just invalidly baptized someone. It means that this chap acted beyond his competence. So, I mean, it's a bit like if I was going through passport control, I was popping back to England, I was going through passport control. And now the guy on passport control looks at my passport, he checks whether I have a legal right to enter the United Kingdom, and then he lets me in. Okay, so the United Kingdom admitted me, right? That's true. But if he then says he's rude to me because he doesn't like people from Newcastle, that doesn't mean that the United Kingdom was just rude to me, right? He wasn't given legal authority to insult people in his capacity as a passport controller. And we have to understand this relationship. Otherwise, things get very confused.
Thank God there's a few people from the United Kingdom that will get that joke that watch this. So, what are some of the important things we should know about church history from past to fix the present to have a good future?
Well, there was in a way, the best way for understanding church history and for understanding Christendom is to understand what the Middle Ages are. And originally, the Middle Ages was invented as an insult. It was a term used by people who were enthusiastic about the sort of neo-pagan revival of the so-called Renaissance, and they referred to the Middle Ages as the boring bit between the wonderful pagan classical antiquity and the wonderful neo-pagan sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century Renaissance. But in fact, it in some ways, unintentionally, it rather well describes the structure of Christian history. There was a great church historian, sadly an Anglican, but he was also blessed by also coming from my town in the northeast Finland. But anyway, his name R.W. Southern. He wrote the second volume in the Penguin History of the Christian Church, which is called, among many other important works, which is called Western Society and the Church in the Middle Ages. And in the opening part of that book, he defines what the Middle Ages were, and he says they're that period during which the Church was identified with the whole of organized society, right? And that's essentially what Christendom is. It's the realization of the social kingship of Christ in the lay order, through the identification of the church with the whole of organized society. And then that helps you to understand the period that comes before the Middle Ages and the period that comes after, because the Middle Ages is middle relative to them. So antiquity, the period before the Middle Ages, is the period during which the church became identified with the whole of organized society. And then modernity, the horrible period in which we're living, is the period during which the church ceased to be identified with the whole of organized society. So Christendom, which is the state of the church as identified with the whole of organized society, is what defines the Middle Ages. And you can understand the history before and after once you understand what caused the identification and what caused the separation. And basically, obviously the conversion of the Roman Empire caused the identification, but and that conversion was expressed legally in several stages, climaxing really with the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day 800, which established that the spiritual power sets up the temporal power in the last analysis. And then the separation occurred in 3 stages or so, from the time of the Reformation until the present day. But there were 2 events, sort of very long processes, which led to the identification and the separation on a kind of social level rather than just a legal level. And the main event that led to the identification was the invasion, the Germanic barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. They completely destroyed the sort of civilized order in the West until the only people left who could read and write were bishops and monks, and everyone else had fled to Byzantium. And so the church reconstructed civilization and the legal order in the West, and that's what allowed the total identification of the church with society in the Latin West. And then what caused the separation was the Reformation. So initially, by invoking this principle of scripture alone, it made it impossible to determine what the true content of Christianity is. So therefore, I mean, so there was about 100 years of disputation and warfare until the end of the 30 Years' War in the middle of the 17th century, when the emperors were definitively prevented from ending the Reformation, because the French kept subsidizing the Protestants to stop them doing it, because they had a rivalry. The 2 families, the French kings and the imperial family, had a rivalry, and the French kings, despite being Catholics, didn't want the imperial family to do too well, so they vigorously sabotaged the military side of the Counter-Reformation. So when the 30 Years' War ended with a stalemate, then it became clear that you couldn't use divine revelation as the principle of public policy and public law if the Counter-Reformation was never going to prevail. And so this new sort of mutated second stage of the polymorph, the Reformation, emerged, which was the Enlightenment, which was a movement to eliminate divine revelation as the source of public policy and public law and secularize Europe. And eventually that completely destroyed the foundations of all the existing European states. And so it moved into the third stage, which was the revolution, which caused the violent separation of Christianity from society. And we're sort of living through that. We're living through the latter stages of that process. And if you look at the three legal stages of identification, you've got the year 312, when Constantine converted, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. That's the kind of stage one. And then 380, when the Emperor Theodosius declared the Catholic faith to be the religion of the Roman Empire. That's the second stage. And then you've got the year 800 with the coronation of Charlemagne. And that's the kind of final stage when the supremacy of the spiritual power is established over the temporal power. And then the undoing also has three stages. So in 1555, there was a treaty whereby the Protestants were permanently recognized as part of the legal order of the Holy Roman Empire because they couldn't get rid of them. It's called the Treaty of Augsburg. And the Emperor, Charles V, was so miserable about having to agree to that he abdicated and went on to live in a monastery for the last years of his life. And he was actually the last emperor to be crowned by the Pope. And then the second stage, and that reverses what happened with Charlemagne, because that treaty agreed that the ruler got to decide what religion his subjects had to have. And that's the opposite of what happened with Charlemagne, which is that Charlemagne got to be emperor because the Pope made him emperor. So instead of the truths of the faith determining who the legitimate ruler was, the ruler determines which religion the people had to hold. And then the second stage was the Concordat of 1801 between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII. And that there'd been a long persecution of the church during the first 10 years of the French Revolution. And the Pope was trying to resolve this, and Napoleon wanted to resolve it as well because he wanted to consolidate his new regime by getting the Catholics back on side. And originally it was intended that this agreement should say that Catholicism was the religion of the French state. But in the end, it was watered down at the last minute to say that it was just the religion of most of the French people. And the result of that was that you no longer had, it undid what happened in 380. No longer did you have Catholicism as formally recognized as true by the civil order. And then the undoing, the third stage would be the return to outright persecution. And we're just sort of entering into that phase at the moment, I'm afraid.
Indeed. We won't get too deep into that part. So obviously the solution is just to return back to the kingship of Christ and invert everything that got inverted. Do you see any signs of inverting the inverted, getting back on the right track? Any head tips, any notches, any positive things you can see to being able to restore this?
Well, at the moment, things don't look amazing. But one of the key principles to remember is that, as Aristotle says, what's last in execution is first in intention. You can't do the right thing now unless you know what it is you're ultimately trying to achieve. And human beings are, as Aristotle also says, political animals. So they don't really, if you don't tell somebody not just what he would look like if his life was transformed by the gospel, but what his society would look like if it was transformed by the gospel, then you're not really evangelizing that person. There's a kind of unreality to the way in which you're proclaiming the gospel. So I think it greatly harms our ability to transmit the gospel to individuals and families, the fact that we're unable at this point, because of the confusion on this issue, to explain to them what the society that they belong to would look like if that society as a whole accepted the gospel. And although it doesn't make much effort to explain how it is, the Vatican II document on religious liberty says that what it's about to say in no way alters the traditional teaching of the church concerning the obligation not just of individuals, but of whole societies to the true religion and the one Church of Christ. And we have to proclaim that aspect of the gospel, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. And I do think that people are slowly beginning to realize that. And in that sense, there's a sign of the very, very smallest buds of spring there, in that people realize now that liberalism is not just this kind of friendly, supposedly neutral environment in which we can all safely pursue the activities of the church without having to make any demands on the civil order. They realize that liberalism is a militant, proselytizing and intolerant worldview which intends to eliminate anything incompatible with it. And it's really impossible to deny that now. I mean, in order for Catholicism not to be offensive to the civil order in modern Western societies, it's obvious that it would have to embrace complete apostasy and transform itself into some horrendous second version of Anglicanism in order to be still acceptable. And more and more people can see that, and so they're beginning to realize that the evangelization of whole societies is not an optional extra.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to get you on and other people in here, just to show them that there's people out here who are teaching this stuff that they might not know. I mean, I run into this every day about someone. I had him on my desk the other day at this conference, Garcia Moreno, and obviously nobody has a clue about him, and he transferred an entire country unto the Sacred Heart of Christ and Immaculate Heart of Mary, and obviously he got killed for it by the Freemasons. But find anybody in the streets that know who that guy is, and you're pretty safe bet. You could bet the house you're not going to find it. What can people?
Well, I mean, the distortion of history is a very serious. I mean, obviously, it used to be again that we had the Catholics without having to just be apologists. You just had Catholic historians gave you the authentic account of history. I mean, Hilaire Belloc was, disproportionately an apologist compared to a historian. I think that's partly because he, had to keep body and soul together. He needs to keep pumping the books out. But it's surprising. I don't agree with every one of Belloc's interpretations of history by any means, but it's surprising how many, particularly in the sort of 70s and 80s, how many historians who were seen as dramatic and novel were just giving you what Belloc said with footnotes instead of his original popular historical analysis. As I say, I don't agree with everything that Belloc has to say, there's no way of separating those two out. You can't understand the future properly or the present unless you really understand the past properly.
So for those that can't go to your class, who would you recommend them read? Like Philip Hughes?
Yes, I do. I use Philip Hughes as my main textbook for the class. I mean, I know he died, I don't know, in the early 60s or something. But in fact, in some ways, that makes him more useful for the purposes of my class, because everything that's happened since the council, this principle that you don't understand the present until you understand the past, applies the other way around. So almost all church history written since the council is really a concealed polemic about the Second Vatican Council from one perspective or another. Yeah. Whereas Hughes is a truly eminent historian with a very good prose style, who knows his stuff, and he's writing before and dying before any of that happens, but just before. So you get quite a helpful perspective. I think Hughes probably is, I don't know, I get the impression that he kind of thinks in regard to the present his present, that although in principle the union of the spiritual and temporal powers is a good thing, in practice, some sort of neutrality and religious liberty is actually works out in general for the best. And I mean, I don't really think he's right about that. Obviously, he doesn't say it expressly. It's just a sort of impression that you get when you read over his. He has a one-volume popular history of the Catholic Church, and a 3-volume, which was supposed to be 4-volume, but he died, History of the Church, which only goes up to the Reformation. And but they're really the same book. They're just a condensed and an expanded version of the same book. But I mean, there is some truth to that perspective that he has, in that. In fact, somebody drew my attention to a letter by the famous French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville the other day, which he wrote about the position of the church in the United States. And he has some important comments on that subject in his book, Democracy in America, which people often cite.
Yeah.
Where he says that the democratic atmosphere of the United States tends to make people into either irreligious or Catholics. And he says that the result is that the US population is slowly dividing between atheism and the Church of Rome. And a lot of people cite this, a very interesting passage, a lot of people cite it as if it was evidence that in fact a situation of civil neutrality is one in which the church prospers. But in fact, this letter is very interesting. He's more frank in the letter than he is in the book. And he says in the letter that the Catholics don't approve of the civil in his time in the United States, don't approve of the civil neutrality of the United States, and they're much more zealous, and that they think that in the end, if there were a vast majority of Catholics in the US, that it jolly well ought to be a formally Catholic civil order, and it's clear from his comments there that he thinks that's the key thing that distinguishes them from the Protestants, who he calls the businessmen of religion, who he says are lacking in zeal. So the ironic thing is that the reason why the Catholics, in his analysis, are profiting from the civil neutrality of the US is because they don't approve of it. Which I suppose is also true of the atheists, because I mean, you can see now that they've turned the supposed civil neutrality into a situation where that involves banning religion from every possible area of social life. So it's obviously not neutrality at all. So Leo XIII said the same thing. He said that the Catholic Church is prospering. He's writing in the late 19th century under the civil order obtaining in the United States, but Catholics mustn't believe that this is the most desirable arrangement. That's not acceptable for Catholics to think that, and so it seems that some kind of provisional neutrality as a result of the regrettable confusion concerning Christianity, which results from the Reformation, is acceptable as a kind of provisional arrangement that's actually quite helpful for the church. But to accept that, and here we come back to this last in execution, first in intention principle, to accept that as a permanent, desirable for its own sake settlement, ultimately destroys the faith. Because if the implication of accepting it as a permanent settlement would be that the truths of the faith are just not certain enough to be the basis of the civil order. And if they're not certain enough to be the basis of the civil order, then they're not certain enough to die for. And if they're not certain enough to die for, then the whole of Christianity makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I mean, and conversely, the implication of liberalism presents itself as a kind of neutral space. But in fact, every ideology and every worldview, true or untrue, has basic assumption that you should have freedom in regard to those things which are matters capable of reasonable doubt, and you should have unity concerning necessities. But they disagree, obviously, as to what's capable of reasonable doubt and what is a necessity. So
What I
if
tell
you
you.
say again, sorry?
It's what I tell you.
Well, exactly, yes. But if you say that, well, in religious matters and matters of overall philosophical worldview, we'll have neutrality and freedom, but then in regard to the basic framework, particularly for buying and selling, we'll have, an iron laws that cannot be broken, then the implication of that is not neutrality, but that mindless hedonistic consumerism is the purpose of human existence. And that's how people have responded. If you buy that this is a desirable permanent settlement instead of a modus vivendi to a more philosophically united society, then you've essentially accepted that hedonism is the purpose of human existence.
Yeah, no kidding on that one. So for everybody out there, what would you say for them to start because I know somebody told me that I got Crisis in the Church by Philip Hughes.
Yeah.
This not out of this. Apparently, it's hard to find. I do
Yeah.
have all 3 volumes of the history of the church.
Yeah.
Brian Grant republished the one he did on English Reformation.
Yeah.
What would be step 1 just to attempt to right the ship?
In terms of perceiving things as they truly are, you mean, in the past? That's a good question. Let's think. There's a really interesting book called by an author who I find very interesting, but I think he's also wrong on a lot of important things, but not in this book. Jacques Maritain wrote this book. He's a French philosopher, Thomas philosopher of the 20th century. He wrote this book called Three Reformers, and it's about Martin Luther, René Descartes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it basically shows the destruction of 3 different aspects of Western civilization. So it's an analysis of how Luther brought down theology, and Descartes brought down speculative philosophy, and Rousseau brought down political philosophy. That's a very good it's a very good thing to look at. There's a
did he need psychological help after researching that book?
I don't know. Well, he subsequently embraced some rather unhelpful ideas, so perhaps he was scarred by the experience. I'm not sure. But really, you can trace that there are really 3 eruptions of something deeper, which is a philosophical error which arose in the 14th century called Nominalism, which denied that there are real natures to things, and that really causes the 3 errors of Luther, Descartes, and Rousseau, because traditional Catholic philosophy, exemplified by St. Thomas Aquinas, but also in St. Augustine and Boethius, traditional Catholic philosophy teaches that there is a real human nature, and that means there's an objective answer to what it means to be a good human being or a bad human being, just like you can tell a good apple or a bad apple when you look at it, because you know what an apple is. So in the same way, you can tell a good human being and a bad human being. And consequently, because God's word is true and efficacious, if God makes you just, declares you just, then he makes you just like when he said, let there be light, there was light. So if he justifies you, then he makes you just. So consequently, we've always held that God renovates the soul at the point at which he forgives our sins, and he pours faith, hope, and charity, and prudence, and justice, and temperance, and fortitude into our souls through sanctifying grace. And but these nominalists held that there was no objective answer to what makes a good human being, because there's no real human nature. So as a consequence, they held that if God commanded you to commit adultery or to tell lies, then that would suddenly become okay. And the most famous of them, William of Ockham, unfortunately a countryman of mine, but he was from the south of England. But anyway, he taught that if God commanded you to curse him, that would become a good thing to do. Just so it's what gets called divine command theory. And so ultimately that issue, and in fact Luther used to refer to Ockham as my master Ockham, rather like Anakin Skywalker. And so he but by Luther's theology is kind of the outflowing of that. So that God justifies us extrinsically. He just says we're just, and then whatever we do from that point onwards is basically okay because he's decided to make it okay. And that then, of course, it also destroys philosophy, and this is expressed through Descartes' writings, because if there's no natures, then there are no things. Because what allows me to tell where my hand ends and the table begins is the fact that my hand is part of a human being and the table is a bit of wood, so the 2 natures distinguish one object from another. If there are no natures, then me moving my little finger is just different in degree from me being shot in the head. So ultimately, there are no real distinctions between things. It's no longer the case, as Plato said, that our mind cuts reality at the joints. It's just you get this kind of metaphysical trench foot. I don't know if you ever heard of trench foot?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So everything, all objects, there are no real objects. They're all bleeding into each other. And so the result is ultimately, if it's as our only experiences of things, that means that we don't actually see the real world. So the whole of modern philosophy goes off down this great crazy rabbit hole of ultimately, I've no idea what the world is like. I'm kind of trapped inside my own mind and all this. It's complete gobbledygook and a vast and terrible waste of time. And then the third effect of this dreadful era of nominalism is what's called contractualism in political philosophy, where whereas the medievals thought that you had to obey your rulers because man is a political animal, and therefore God wills that man live in political society, and political societies have to have rules, and therefore the people who make up those rules get their authority from nature and therefore from God. Hence St. Paul says the powers that be are ordained of God. Now that sounds a bit sort of authoritarian and hard line, but in fact it isn't really, because there are several consequences of this. One is that, well, the first consequence is that you have to do as you're told by your temporal rulers, but the second consequence is that if your temporal rulers tell you to do something which is contrary to the natural law, that's immoral, then you don't have to do what you're told. And if they try and force you to do something that's contrary to the natural law, then you get the divine authority that they used to have to rule you transfers to you to resist them. So it actually quite severely limits the authority of temporal rulers. And another consequence of this is that because man is a political animal, then insofar as it's possible, it's good for all human beings to participate in the civil order to some degree or another. Now that will vary from one society to another, depending on, like we were talking about earlier with the fall of the Roman Empire, the only literate people left were a few monks and bishops. So it wasn't that easy for, Og the serf to participate in the government of his particular Dark Ages monarchy. But nevertheless, all the other things being equal, it actually encourages the participation. Leo XIII says this in a very fine encyclical of his called Libertas. He says that all other things being equal, everyone should try and contribute to the civil order. But once you say there's no human nature, then man can't be a political animal because he's got no nature to be political. So instead, this dreadful theory, which sounds as if it's the basis of liberty and everything, but in fact is a nightmare, called contractualism, comes along, which is the idea that the reason why we have to do what the rulers tell us is because we all entered into this mysterious social contract to agree to do whatever the rulers tell us. So it sounds like that's wonderful, and it's freedom because we all had a contract, but it's not wonderful at all, because there isn't such a contract for a start. It never happened. As Leo XIII says, that the contract which they allege is manifestly a fiction. So it never happened. But you have to believe in this fairy story. Everyone has to believe that everybody somehow, in some unknown past they can't remember, agreed to this contract. Because if anyone didn't, then they would be free to do whatever they like, you see, because they wouldn't be part of the civil order and everything would collapse. So we all have to believe in the fairy story of the social contract. And then there's no limitations to what the state can do, because we've agreed in advance to everything that it feels like doing. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's right or wrong, because it's all about the contract and not about that at all. So you end up with, instead of, it sounds as if it's all wonderful and about liberty, unlike St. Paul telling us the powers that be are ordained of God. But in fact, what it ends up with is, the democratic republic of this and the people's republic of that. And you find that your family's being whisked off to a concentration camp. The first French Republic used to have on its banners, La République une et indivisible de liberté, égalité, fraternité ou mort, the one and indivisible republic of liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. And that didn't mean, that we were willing to fight for the death of these things. It also meant that if you don't accept our interpretation of these things, then you just have to die.
Yep.
And they lived by those principles, and they executed them in several senses of the word execute.
Literally.
Yes, yeah.
No, that's, and you think about that. I was thinking about that, the birth canal contract thing is, wherever you go through the canal before you get your first breath, you sign your oath to the state, and you're supposed to obey everything there. There's your contract right there.
Oh,
So we're going to wrap that up right there just because that's going to be a lot for a lot of people to hold on to. But
Okay, sorry.
no. That's perfect. Exactly what I was wanting you to do. But definitely have to do this again, especially when I got my kid and dinner's on the table.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it. And yeah, we look forward to doing it again. And you have a great night.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.